Chile isn't just a country defined by borders, it's defined by contrast. Stretching over deserts and glaciers, mountains and coastline, its landscapes seem to reflect the same complexity found within its people. But beyond what we see, beyond language, food, and tradition, lies a deeper truth, one written in DNA. This is the story of Chile told through bloodlines, a history not found in textbooks but encrypted in chromosomes. It's the kind of story that doesn't begin with colonization, or even civilization, but far earlier, with migrations that go back tens of thousands of years. Every Chilean today carries echoes of journeys that began long before Chile even had a name. In the north, indigenous groups like the Aymara shaped early Andean societies. Farther south, the Mapuche resisted conquest and kept their cultural identity intact, generation after generation. Their legacy wasn't just cultural, it became genetic. Scientists have found that indigenous maternal DNA is dominant throughout the country, particularly in regions like Araucania and the Atacama, where Amerindian genetic markers surpass 50%. And yet, most Chileans today live in the central regions, places like Santiago and Valparaiso, where the European genetic signature is strongest. This creates a paradox. A nation that often identifies more with European roots, while being genetically deeply native. But how did this dual identity begin? The answer lies in the 16th century, when Spanish ships crossed the ocean, not just with weapons and priests, but with genes. Colonization wasn't just political, it was biological. Yet the mix wasn't equal. Spanish men fathered generations of children with indigenous women, a pattern we can still see clearly today. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, is overwhelmingly indigenous in cities like Santiago, reaching nearly 84%. Meanwhile, the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, tells a different story. About 70% of it is European in origin. That imbalance speaks volumes about power, resistance, and survival. Even lesser-known contributors to Chile's DNA made lasting impressions. African ancestry, often overlooked in national narratives, makes up about 2 to 3% of the average Chilean's genome, higher in the north. Brought during colonial times through Pacific slave routes, this ancestry quietly embedded itself into the nation's bloodline. And as the centuries moved on, more threads were added to the tapestry. Germans in the south, Palestinians and Croatians in the cities, Italians and British immigrants. While small in number, each group left its genetic fingerprint, woven into the urban middle class and cultural fabric of modern Chile. But perhaps what's most striking is not just the mixture itself, it's how people see it. Surveys show that most Chileans identify as white, yet over half acknowledge having indigenous blood. And the science supports this inner contradiction. Autosomal DNA, the kind that comes from both parents, reveals the average Chilean has about 42% indigenous ancestry and 55% European, regardless of how they look, speak, or live. What this means is that Chile is not a country of defined categories. It's a country of quiet, intricate convergence. Geneticists call this pattern admixture, but for Chileans, it's simply identity. A subtle inheritance of conquest, migration, resistance, and resilience. It shapes more than the past. It influences the future. From health risks to drug responses, understanding ancestry is now key to personalized medicine. But even beyond science, knowing your DNA means knowing your story, and perhaps understanding others a little better too. Chile is a country shaped like no other, a narrow ribbon stretching thousands of kilometers between the Pacific Ocean and the towering Andes. This land isn't just unique in shape, but in its ability to conceal and reveal ancestry across its extreme geography. The mountains act like walls, the deserts like filters, the coastline a window open to the world. And between these natural boundaries, generations of people moved, settled, adapted, and their genes adapted with them. In many ways, Chile's geography didn't just protect it from outside forces. It became a silent sculptor of its population's DNA. This long, isolated corridor made Chile a living experiment in human genetics. Natural obstacles restricted internal movement, meaning populations in the north, center, and south evolved with distinct genetic patterns. In the north, DNA studies show that indigenous ancestry can exceed 50%, a reflection of ancient Andean civilizations that thrived before European contact. As we move down the map, those proportions shift. In central Chile, particularly around Santiago, European ancestry dominates, mirroring the colonial-era settlements that formed the political and economic core. Farther south, in regions like La Araucanía, Mapuche influence surges once again, not only in language and culture, but deeply embedded in genetic code. This variation is no coincidence. Geneticists have traced these patterns to a diffusion process, a slow movement of people and their genes, guided by the landscape itself. The Central Valleys, rich and accessible, invited more European immigration and intermixing. Meanwhile, the far north and south remained less touched by mass settlement, preserving stronger indigenous lineages. Even African ancestry shows a geographic fingerprint, more pronounced in northern cities, once connected to colonial trade routes from Peru and beyond. But it's not just about where people lived, it's also about when. Chile's genomic timelines suggest that the mixing of ancestries began roughly 10 generations ago, around the early colonial period. Using recombination patterns in DNA, scientists can now estimate when different ancestral lines converged. These genetic clocks confirm what history implies, that while waves of admixture occurred, much of it remained locally concentrated, creating the regional genetic signatures we see today. Yet even within regions, there are layers. Cities like Valparaiso show a higher concentration of European ancestry among the middle class, up to 77% in some studies. But just a few hours north or south, indigenous DNA becomes dominant once again. These micro-shifts reflect migration, colonization, and even economic factors. How wealth and class often followed lines of ancestry, and how that legacy still shapes genetic landscapes in subtle, often unspoken ways. All of this makes Chile a rare case in Latin America, a country whose geography didn't erase diversity, but etched it deeper, where the Andes weren't barriers, but timekeepers, where each region carries a different chapter of genetic history, influenced not by borders drawn on a map, but by the silent pull of mountains, rivers, and valleys. The truth is, to understand the DNA of Chileans, you can't just look at people. You have to look at the land that shaped them. The isolation didn't create purity. It preserved variety. And through that variety, a genetic mosaic formed that's unlike anywhere else in the world. Long before any ships sailed from Europe, before names like Santiago or Valparaiso were ever spoken, Chile was already alive, not just with people, but with civilizations. Indigenous groups didn't just inhabit this land. They were its architects, its storytellers, its genetic backbone. Today, their legacy is not confined to folklore or faded artifacts. It endures silently in the DNA of millions. And yet, the full scope of their contribution is only now being uncovered through genetic science, exposing a past that was more resilient, more widespread, and more genetically influential than most had imagined. The first footprints on Chilean soil date back over 12,000 years. From the deserts of the Atacama to the forests of Patagonia, early peoples thrived in one of the planet's most ecologically challenging regions. The Mapuche in the south, the Aymara in the north, the Diaguita in the valleys, each developed distinct cultures, languages, and genetic markers. But what unites them today is how deeply their genetic signature persists within the modern Chilean population. In fact, some of the earliest known markers in Chileans today trace directly back to these pre-Columbian ancestors. Modern genomic tools have allowed researchers to separate the noise of centuries and zero in on the quiet signals left by these indigenous lineages. One striking discovery is the presence of haplogroups that are virtually exclusive to Native American ancestry, particularly in mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to child. These maternal lines remain unbroken in many Chilean families, stretching back thousands of years, untouched even by colonization. In many cases, this indigenous maternal continuity exists even in individuals who may not identify with any indigenous culture today. But the genetic influence doesn't end with maternal inheritance. Autosomal DNA, the kind we inherit from both parents, reveals that indigenous ancestry forms a substantial component of the Chilean genome. Studies across different regions show that this influence varies, but rarely disappears. In some northern areas, Indigenous DNA constitutes the majority. In the far south, Mapuche lineage dominates entire communities. And even in metropolitan centers, once thought to be primarily European, researchers are consistently finding indigenous ancestry woven into the background of the population. This isn't just about numbers or percentages. It's about what these markers tell us. Genetic traces from these early peoples reveal adaptations to altitude, climate, and disease. Proof of how their bodies evolved to survive the harshest environments long before modern medicine or infrastructure existed. These ancient adaptations are still present in modern Chileans, shaping how they respond to their environment, to illness, even to nutrition. But perhaps the most powerful part of this story is what it reveals about survival. Many of Chile's indigenous groups faced centuries of erasure through war, displacement, and forced assimilation. And yet, their legacy remained in the most intimate place possible, inside the cells of their descendants. While languages were lost and borders redrawn, the DNA endured. Every modern Chilean who carries these markers, whether they know it or not, is walking proof of that resilience. This isn't history that sits in museums. It's alive, passed on in every generation, waiting to be acknowledged. And for many Chileans, uncovering that genetic truth isn't just informative, it's transformative. It reshapes how identity is viewed, how ancestry is claimed, and how the past continues to live in the present. When Spanish forces set foot on Chilean soil in the 1500s, they didn't just bring steel and scripture. They brought irreversible change to the genetic makeup of the land. The meeting of two worlds wasn't a moment. It was a seismic shift, a process that unfolded over generations, altering bloodlines, hierarchies, and identities in ways that still echo through every cell of the modern Chilean. The Spanish conquest didn't replace the indigenous presence, it absorbed it. But the nature of that absorption was uneven, and the pattern reveals a deep asymmetry. Most of the colonizers were men. Few brought wives. And in the colonies, relationships between Spanish men and indigenous women became widespread. Some forced, others strategic, all of them consequential. The children born from these unions marked the beginning of a new population, mestizos, individuals with ancestry from both colonizer and native. But this wasn't a smooth fusion of cultures. It was layered with imbalance, power dynamics, and a hierarchy that tied ancestry directly to social privilege. Genetic evidence lays this history bare. Y chromosome studies show an overwhelming prevalence of Iberian paternal lineage, while mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through mothers, remains largely indigenous. This isn't just data. It's a silent record of colonial gender dynamics, where the Spanish male presence left its mark, and indigenous women carried forward the future population. These patterns weren't limited to isolated cases. They became the genetic architecture of the nation. Mestizage, the process of racial and cultural mixing, wasn't just biological. It became a state-building tool. The emerging elite redefined identity, favoring European traits and gradually embedding the idea that whiteness equaled status. Over time, this ideology filtered into law, religion, and education, creating an illusion of homogeneity that masked the diversity written into every family tree. People of mixed ancestry were encouraged to identify upwards, to associate with European heritage, while distancing themselves from indigenous roots, both socially and sometimes legally. And yet, the genetic footprint tells a different story. Even among those who rose in status, indigenous ancestry remained inescapable, hidden in the background, carried in chromosomes, passed quietly through generations. Mestizage didn't erase indigenous blood. It wove it into every layer of Chilean society, whether publicly acknowledged or not. The transformation wasn't just demographic, it was cultural. Language shifted, religions blended, customs evolved. Spanish became dominant, but traces of indigenous influence persisted in food, agricultural practices, even place names. This cultural blending, while often framed as a fusion, was deeply shaped by colonial power structures, and genetics captured the results with brutal honesty. Later, Chile's independence didn't undo this legacy. In fact, it entrenched it. The new republics embraced the mestizo identity, but often sanitized its indigenous elements. The colonial caste system faded, but its impact endured in how people perceived themselves and others. Phenotype, surname, and geography began to subtly dictate assumptions about ancestry, assumptions often disconnected from the actual genetic makeup of individuals. What makes the story of mestizage in Chile so complex is that it never followed a single path. It varied by region, by time period, by social class. In some rural communities, indigenous traditions and bloodlines remained strong and visible. In urban centers, assimilation ran deeper. But regardless of visibility, the genetic data confirms a single truth. No modern Chilean is untouched by this era, whether by lineage, by legacy, or by both. The age of mestizage reshaped the very fabric of who Chileans are. There's a chapter in Chile's genetic history that often goes untold. It's not taught with the same pride, nor discussed with the same clarity. And yet, it exists, quietly, persistently, in the background of countless Chilean family lines. This is the story of African ancestry in Chile, a presence often overlooked, yet scientifically undeniable. Though it arrived in chains, its legacy cannot be bound, because it's now part of the very essence of the nation. During the colonial period, while the Spanish crown funneled its energy into the conquest of the Americas, it also expanded the transatlantic slave trade deep into South America. Chile was never a primary destination for African slaves, but that didn't make it immune. African men, women, and children were brought through Pacific ports, often via Peru, and sold into labor in mines, households, and haciendas. Most were absorbed into the lower social strata, where their presence was systematically erased from historical narratives. And yet, science remembers what history tried to forget. Modern DNA studies have identified traces of African ancestry in nearly all regions of Chile, particularly in the north, where colonial trade routes were most active. The numbers may seem small, around 2 to 3% on average, but in genetics, small doesn't mean insignificant. In some individuals, that ancestry is much higher, and it carries with it stories of survival, adaptation, and generational endurance. One of the most revealing aspects of this ancestry is how it persists invisibly. Many Chileans with African markers in their DNA may not know their family tree includes African roots. That's because admixture over centuries diluted physical traits, while colonial structures diluted acknowledgement. Over time, African identity was folded into broader categories like mestizo, obscuring its origins even as its bloodlines endured. Even more telling is how African DNA appears in both autosomal and Y chromosome studies. This indicates that African men, like indigenous women, contributed directly to the formation of Chile's current gene pool. The legacy isn't limited to biology. Cultural elements, rhythms in music, culinary influences, even regional dialects, bear subtle African imprints that few recognize, but many live with every day. Despite this presence, Afro-descendant communities in Chile today remain relatively small and underrepresented. The societal silence around African ancestry isn't just a historical oversight, it's a reflection of ongoing invisibility. But DNA doesn't stay silent. The resurgence of genetic research is now forcing a national reckoning with this neglected heritage. Every genome tested adds a new data point, and the picture that emerges is one of greater complexity, deeper connection, and undeniable African contribution. Understanding this part of Chile's genetic mosaic is not about rewriting the past. It's about recognizing the fullness of it. The African story in Chile isn't a footnote. It's a thread, woven through generations, often unseen but never lost. It challenges the way Chileans define identity, and it enriches the broader understanding of who they really are. Across Chile's staggering length, from desert peaks to southern ice fields, an invisible map unfolds, not of provinces or highways, but of ancestral currents moving through the veins of millions. The nation's genetic identity doesn't flow in straight lines. It forms a gradient, a subtle transition of ancestral weight, changing as you move across latitudes. What appears to be a single people is, in fact, a complex blend of histories shaped by the land beneath their feet. In the far north, where Chile touches the Andean highlands, the indigenous footprint is deep and persistent. DNA studies show that in cities like Arica and Iquique, indigenous ancestry often surpasses 50%. The proximity to ancient civilizations, from the Aymara to the Tiwanaku, left a lasting imprint. These were regions where agriculture and trade thrived long before colonial forces arrived, and where native bloodlines remained strongly preserved, even after centuries of upheaval. Traveling southward, the story shifts. Central Chile, especially the area between Valparaiso and Santiago, presents a sharp rise in European ancestry. This region became the hub of colonial governance and post-independence development. With its fertile valleys and growing urban centers, it attracted successive waves of European settlers, creating a population profile that leans more heavily toward Iberian roots. In some studies, European ancestry in this region surpasses 70%, especially among the urban middle class. Yet even here, beneath the surface, indigenous lineage never fully disappeared. It only became less visible. Then comes the south, where the Andes descend into forests and rivers, and where genetic studies reveal a resurgence of native ancestry. In places like Temuco and Osorno, the influence of the Mapuche is not only cultural but biologically dominant. The genetic signatures here are distinct, carrying unique markers passed down through generations who resisted colonization fiercely and maintained a strong presence despite political and military pressure. This region shows some of the highest indigenous admixture rates in the country, not as a relic, but as a living heritage. But what's even more fascinating is how these gradients don't create hard boundaries. Instead, they form a fluid spectrum. Moving from one region to another, ancestry doesn't shift abruptly. It flows, blending gradually across space. This phenomenon, recognized by population geneticists as clinal variation, mirrors the geography itself: mountains, rivers, and valleys guiding human movement, shaping who interacted, intermarried, and settled where. The gradient extends beyond autosomal averages. Y-DNA and mitochondrial studies also show regional divergence, suggesting that not only did people mix differently in each zone, but that gendered ancestry patterns varied as well. In the north, African ancestry is more frequently detected, a residual trace of slave routes and trade posts once connected to the colonial economies of Peru. In the center, European paternal lines dominate. In the south, maternal indigenous lines are especially prominent, reinforcing the unique story of how ancestry unfolded differently depending on geography. This regional diversity doesn't just inform academic research, it holds real-world implications. Medical studies have shown that certain genetic predispositions vary along this north-to-south axis, from metabolic responses to disease susceptibility. The genomic landscape of Chile directly affects health outcomes, sometimes in ways that are still being uncovered. And yet, for all its complexity, Chile remains a unified country, a nation whose diversity doesn't divide, but defines. This tripartite genomic structure is not a sign of fragmentation. It's evidence of a people shaped by different terrains, histories, and lineages, yet bound together by a shared story written in the deepest layers of their biology. While colonial conquest shaped the early foundations of Chile's genetic profile, the story didn't end there. In the centuries that followed independence, a quieter transformation unfolded, one carried not by soldiers, but by settlers. From distant lands across Europe and the Middle East, thousands arrived seeking refuge, land, or new beginnings. And although their numbers were smaller compared to the massive waves seen in other Latin American nations, these immigrants left behind more than architecture and language. They embedded themselves into the very genome of Chile. In the southern regions, the arrival of German families in the 19th century was part of a state-sponsored plan to populate and civilize the frontier. Towns like Puerto Varas, Valdivia, and Fertiller became cultural outposts where German customs thrived. But beyond language and tradition, their legacy seeped into bloodlines. Genetic studies in these areas show elevated levels of Central European ancestry, a subtle deviation from the dominant Iberian pattern seen elsewhere in the country. These genetic footprints didn't spread nationwide, but locally. They reshaped family trees in ways still traceable today. Further north, Valparaiso became a magnet for diverse communities: British merchants, Croatian sailors, French artisans, and Italian craftsmen. They weren't settlers in the traditional sense, but integrated through commerce, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. The result? A patchwork of European genetic inputs that enriched urban gene pools. In places like Vina del Mar and Santiago, genetic variation increased subtly, adding new layers to the already complex mestizo identity. Perhaps the most unexpected contribution came from the Middle East. Palestinians and Lebanese migrants, many fleeing persecution or economic hardship, began arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Today, Chile is home to the largest Palestinian diaspora outside the Arab world. Their genetic contribution is modest in scale, but notable in cultural influence, particularly in urban centers, where intermarriage brought Southwest Asian markers into Chilean DNA. Over generations, this influence became indistinguishable from broader mestizo profiles, yet its origin remains identifiable in fine-scale genomic mapping. Despite the diversity of these groups, their impact was often diluted over time. Intermarriage with local populations led to the absorption of their genetic traits into the broader national genome. Still, certain surnames, regional physical traits, and community structures hint at this rich legacy. It's a reminder that ancestry isn't always about dominance in numbers. Sometimes, it's about persistence through generations of quiet continuity. These immigrant waves also challenged social perceptions. While Spanish ancestry was historically equated with status, newer European arrivals, especially those from Germany or Britain, introduced a more complex hierarchy of whiteness. Some were embraced, others resisted. Over time, however, their cultural and genetic presence became part of the Chilean mainstream, no longer distinct, but diffused. What makes this part of Chile's genetic story so compelling is its contrast with the dominant narrative. Most discussions about ancestry in Chile focus on indigenous and Spanish roots. But beneath the surface, the genome holds traces of a broader journey, one that crossed oceans and blurred identities. These immigrant echoes don't shout, they whisper, quietly expanding the definition of what it means to be Chilean. Every human genome tells a story, not just of where someone comes from, but how their ancestors adapted to survive. In Chile, that story carries signatures of endurance, evolution, and fine-tuned biological responses shaped over thousands of years. Far beyond the questions of ancestry and identity, the DNA of Chileans offers insights into something even more intimate: how their bodies interact with the world, how they respond to disease, and how the past continues to influence their health in the present. In recent years, scientists studying Chilean genomes have uncovered markers that go far beyond ethnicity. These markers speak to selection, the quiet process by which certain genetic traits become more common because they offer an advantage in survival. One such example is the EDR gene, which influences hair structure, tooth morphology, and sweat gland density. Found at high frequencies in individuals with Native American ancestry, this gene reflects ancient adaptations to specific climates, diets, and environments. Its prevalence in Chileans today is a living memory of that ancestral resilience. Another fascinating discovery involves genes linked to skin pigmentation, such as SLC45A2. This gene, commonly associated with lighter skin tones, is more prevalent in individuals with European lineage. But in a country as genetically mixed as Chile, the distribution of such genes doesn't align neatly with appearance. Phenotype and genotype often diverge, showing that outward traits don't always reveal the full biological complexity underneath. This makes Chile an important population for studying how genetics and environment interact, and why assumptions based on appearance can be misleading. The health implications are just as profound. Genome-wide association studies, GWAS, conducted in admixed populations, like Chile's, are revealing how diverse ancestry can influence susceptibility to conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, and autoimmune disorders. In fact, the combination of indigenous and European ancestry appears to influence how individuals metabolize certain medications, a discovery that is shaping the future of precision medicine in Latin America. For Chileans, this means that understanding their ancestral mix isn't just cultural curiosity. It can be a key to better healthcare outcomes. But the research hasn't come without challenges. Traditional genomic studies have long focused on populations of European descent, leaving admixed groups underrepresented. This creates a gap in data and can lead to misdiagnosis or ineffective treatments. Chile, with its unique blend of ancestries, has become a vital part of efforts to close this gap. By studying the Chilean genome in greater depth, researchers are beginning to design healthcare solutions that are tailored, accurate, and inclusive of the region's full diversity. Even beyond medical application, Chile's genetic data is helping scientists understand human evolution on a broader scale. Adaptations related to altitude tolerance in Andean populations, for example, are being analyzed through genes involved in oxygen regulation. These same adaptations, once essential for survival in mountainous terrain, still affect how bodies function today, from athletic performance to cardiovascular health. And yet, perhaps the most powerful insight comes not from what these genes do, but from how they connect people to a much older story. A story of migration across the Bering Strait, of survival through ice ages, of blending with colonizers and resisting extinction. These aren't just sequences in a laboratory database. They're ancestral footprints, still active within the daily biology of every Chilean alive today. The story of Chile's ancestry isn't just about who came from where. It's also about how they came, and who carried the generations forward. When geneticists began tracing maternal and paternal lineages separately, they uncovered a striking pattern etched deep into Chile's population. It's a pattern that reveals not only biology, but the unequal power structures of colonial history, and the quiet strength of those who endured it. Mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mother to child, acts as a direct line to the maternal past. In Chile, these maternal lines overwhelmingly point to indigenous origins. In several studies, particularly in urban centers, Native American haplogroups dominate the mitochondrial landscape. This means that even in regions where European ancestry appears strong, the maternal roots tell a different, older story, one anchored in the original inhabitants of the land. In contrast, when scientists examined the Y chromosome, inherited only through the male line, they found a mirror image. Here, the majority of lineages traced back to Europe, most often Spain. The imbalance between these two genetic channels speaks volumes. It reflects a colonial reality where European men, arriving alone or in small groups, fathered children with indigenous women, often in contexts marked by coercion or economic pressure. The resulting generations inherited a biological duality that mirrored a deeply asymmetric history. But this isn't just a tale of conquest. It's also a testament to survival. The maternal legacy that persists in Chile today is evidence of continuity. It means that despite centuries of upheaval, the bloodlines of indigenous women carried forward entire populations. They raised families, sustained cultures, and unknowingly preserved ancient genetic signatures that would later become key to understanding national identity. This gendered legacy doesn't stop at DNA. It subtly shapes society. The children of these unions often found themselves in a social limbo, not fully accepted by the colonial elite, yet removed from their mother's original communities. Over time, the state began to define them collectively as mestizos, creating a new identity category that both acknowledged and concealed their origins. In this process, indigenous contributions were often minimized, while European heritage was emphasized. Even in modern times, these gendered patterns influence self-perception. Many Chileans proudly trace their surnames to Spain or Germany, yet know little about the maternal ancestry hidden behind generations of patriarchal naming. It's not just a cultural blind spot, it's a biological disconnect, and it reveals how identity can be shaped as much by what is remembered as by what is forgotten. What makes the Chilean case particularly compelling is the scale of this phenomenon. In other Latin American countries, similar patterns exist, but few show the same degree of consistency across regions and social groups. The widespread dominance of indigenous maternal lineages across Chile suggests that this wasn't isolated. It was systemic, a foundational structure that built the population from the inside out. The implications extend beyond ancestry. They touch on how history is told, who is centered in national narratives, and which voices remain missing. But DNA doesn't forget. The story carried by every Chilean genome is clear. The formation of this nation relied on the endurance of indigenous women, and the consequences of colonial gender imbalance continue to shape identity today. In Chile, identity is often worn with pride, but it's not always worn with accuracy. Ask a group of Chileans about their heritage, and you'll hear a range of answers. European, white, mestizo, sometimes indigenous. But delve beneath the surface, beyond surnames and appearances, and the reality becomes far more nuanced. The story Chileans tell themselves about who they are doesn't always match the one written in their DNA. Sociological surveys have revealed a consistent pattern. A significant portion of the population self-identifies as white or predominantly European, even in areas where genetic studies show high levels of indigenous ancestry. This disconnect isn't just a matter of perception. It's rooted in centuries of social conditioning. From colonial classifications to modern aspirations, Chilean society has long associated European lineage with prestige, education, and progress. As a result, many have unconsciously absorbed an identity narrative that prioritizes appearance over genetic truth. But DNA doesn't bend to ideology. Genome-wide analyses conducted across diverse regions in Chile have consistently shown that indigenous ancestry plays a much larger role in the national genetic makeup than public perception reflects. In fact, many individuals who see themselves as entirely European carry a substantial percentage of Native American ancestry, inherited through maternal lines that stretch back long before colonization. This contrast between perception and biology isn't unique to Chile, but it takes on special significance in a country where class, appearance, and identity are tightly intertwined. Social mobility has historically been linked to lighter skin, European surnames, and urban speech patterns. These traits became unspoken markers of status, while indigenous roots were often ignored or, worse, concealed. Over generations, this dynamic created a collective narrative where certain ancestries were emphasized, others dismissed. Yet the truth is far more complex. Genetic data shows that even among the elite, politicians, professionals, cultural figures, indigenous markers appear with regularity. These findings challenge the idea that ancestry is confined to the margins or to rural communities. It also raises questions about national identity. If nearly everyone carries a mix of heritages, what does it mean to be Chilean? This growing awareness is beginning to shift conversations. As DNA testing becomes more accessible, individuals are confronting unexpected revelations about their heritage. For some, it sparks a sense of pride. For others, discomfort. But for many, it opens a door to understanding their past in a way that transcends labels. It becomes an invitation to embrace a broader identity, one rooted not just in skin tone or family lore, but in deep biological truth. There's also a generational shift at play. Younger Chileans, exposed to global discussions about race, ancestry, and colonial legacies, are more open to questioning inherited beliefs. They're beginning to recognize that true identity isn't about fitting into a category. It's about acknowledging all the pieces that built who they are. And in Chile, those pieces span continents, cultures, and centuries. Ultimately, the tension between perception and reality is not a flaw, it's a window. A way to explore how national myths are constructed, and how science can offer a more inclusive, honest narrative. One where being Chilean doesn't mean choosing between roots, but recognizing the value of them all. Every war leaves behind ruins, but some scars are invisible, carried not in cities or monuments, but in strands of DNA. In Chile, the echoes of historical conflict, territorial expansion, and political upheaval are not only written in history books. They're imprinted in the genetic structure of the population itself. Each moment of national transformation altered more than maps. It quietly reshaped the country's gene pool, often in irreversible ways. The War of the Pacific in the late 19th century redrew Chile's northern borders, incorporating regions that had long been part of indigenous Andean civilizations. This territorial gain wasn't just strategic, it brought in populations with distinct ancestral lineages. Genetic studies today still reflect this integration, showing elevated indigenous and African admixture in areas once belonging to Peru and Bolivia. These aren't just demographic shifts, they're genomic signatures left by history's hand. Further south, the military campaign known as the Pacification of Araucania aimed to exert control over Mapuche territory. While the name suggests diplomacy, the reality was displacement and cultural suppression. Entire communities were uprooted, and in some cases, assimilated into the growing Chilean state. Yet, even under pressure, many Mapuche groups preserved their genetic continuity. Modern DNA from southern regions reveals this resilience, with unique haplotypes that trace directly back to pre-colonial lineages, despite the state's effort to erase them. The 20th century brought a different kind of upheaval. Political polarization, waves of migration, and the long shadow of dictatorship all shaped population movements across the country. Families fled rural areas for cities, entire communities shifted regions, and in some cases, individuals went into exile abroad, returning years later, often with new family branches. These relocations influenced mating patterns, broke long-standing geographic genetic isolation, and introduced fresh variation into the national genome. Even economic change played a role. The nitrate boom in the north and the industrial expansion in the central zone attracted internal migrants from across the country. In doing so, it fostered new genetic mixing. Individuals from indigenous majority areas relocated to more European-leaning cities, blending ancestries that had once remained regionally distinct. Over time, the country's demographic map began to blur, and the genome responded in kind. Borders, too, have been more fluid than they appear on paper. Inhabitants of border regions often share ancestry with neighboring countries, a legacy of centuries-old trade, intermarriage, and cross-border kinship. In places like Arica or Patagonia, genetic data reflects this permeability. It shows that national identity doesn't always align with biological ancestry, and that the human body remembers connections that politics often forget. These changes are often invisible on the surface. Generations later, few people link their ancestry to a war or migration event, but their genomes do. Recombination patterns, ancestral fragments, and regional haplogroups still carry the imprint of history, long after the events themselves have faded from memory. It's a form of biological archaeology, uncovering truths not found in any document or census. Understanding how conflict and state-building shaped Chile's DNA challenges the idea that identity is static. It shows that who we are genetically is as much the result of human decisions, ambitions, and movements as it is a biology. The genome, after all, is not just a record of inheritance. It's a witness to everything a people have endured. Across the globe, genetic maps reveal stunning patterns of migration, mixing, and adaptation. Each country tells its own ancestral story, shaped by its geography, its history, and the people who walked its soil. But Chile stands apart, not because of a singular origin, but because of the balance it strikes. Positioned at the southern edge of the continent, isolated by mountains and sea, yet still deeply entangled in global ancestry threads, Chile offers a case study in both uniqueness and universality. When compared to other Latin American countries, Chile's genetic composition lands somewhere in the middle, but not in the sense of simplicity. While nations like Bolivia and Peru show higher proportions of indigenous ancestry, and Argentina leans more heavily European, Chile's genome reflects a nuanced interplay of both. It is neither the most indigenous nor the most European, but a dynamic blend where both lineages remain consistently present across the entire country. This equilibrium becomes even more striking when placed alongside Mexico, Colombia, or Brazil. In Mexico, indigenous roots are often stronger in the south, with European dominance rising in the north. Brazil, on the other hand, exhibits a rich triracial admixture with significant African input, especially in coastal regions. Chile, by contrast, shows a more consistent admixture profile longitudinally, with regional variation, yes, but a relatively steady presence of native and European ancestry across the map. This steady blend suggests a different colonial trajectory, one where demographic mixing became embedded early and persisted across centuries with less interruption. But global comparisons go beyond numbers. They also show where Chile fits in broader narratives of migration and adaptation. In East Asia, for instance, populations often display low admixture due to long-term geographic and cultural isolation. In contrast, many Caribbean nations show extreme admixture variability due to intensive transatlantic slave trade dynamics. Chile, again, occupies an intermediate position, marked by deep indigenous continuity, yet overlaid with colonial and post-colonial waves that reshape the population without erasing its foundations. On the scientific front, Chilean genomes are gaining recognition for their value in medical research. Their complex yet traceable admixture makes them ideal for studying disease risk, gene-environment interaction, and pharmacogenomics in mixed populations. Unlike many European genomes, which reflect relative homogeneity, Chilean DNA presents an opportunity to understand how ancestral diversity impacts biology in real time, a contribution that's increasingly relevant in an era of globalized healthcare. Moreover, the presence of ancient Amerindian haplotypes found in Chilean DNA offers a bridge to prehistoric human migration studies. These genetic markers help researchers trace the peopling of the Americas, from the first humans who crossed the Bering Strait to those who reached the southernmost edges of the continent. Chilean DNA thus connects the global story of humanity, anchoring it in a place once thought to be the end of the world, but now understood as a vital part of its beginning. In cultural terms, too, Chileans are beginning to engage more with their place in this global genetic network. International DNA testing platforms are revealing to ordinary people connections they never imagined, with distant cousins in Europe, indigenous links that span the Andes, and even shared ancestry with populations across the Pacific. These revelations don't just reshape personal identity. They offer a broader sense of belonging in a world increasingly aware of how interwoven we all are. Ultimately, to compare Chilean DNA with the rest of the world is not to rank it, but to understand its place in a shared human mosaic. It shows that while every nation has its own story, the threads that compose it often come from far beyond its borders, and sometimes from far deeper in time than we ever imagined. As the field of genetics races forward, certain populations are emerging as key players in decoding the mysteries of human health, evolution, and identity. Chile, with its rich and layered genomic structure, is no longer just a subject of regional interest. It's becoming a global reference point. From laboratories in Santiago to research centers across Europe and North America, Chilean DNA is being studied not only for what it reveals about the past, but for the breakthroughs it may unlock in the future. One of the most promising frontiers is personalized medicine. The mixed genetic landscape of Chileans, shaped by indigenous, European, and minor African contributions, provides a natural laboratory for exploring how ancestry affects drug metabolism and disease vulnerability. Scientists analyzing these complex patterns are identifying population-specific genetic variants that influence how individuals respond to medications. These findings are already helping inform more precise treatment plans for conditions like hypertension, diabetes, and autoimmune disorders, with the long-term goal of tailoring therapies to individual genetic profiles. Chilean genomes are also proving valuable in correcting long-standing biases in global genetic databases. For decades, most medical and genomic research has been centered on individuals of European descent. As a result, discoveries and treatments have often failed to address the needs of more diverse populations. Including Chile's genetic diversity helps close this gap, offering a broader, more equitable foundation for scientific progress. Each genome added from Latin America expands the map of human variation, making medicine smarter and fairer for everyone. Beyond healthcare, Chilean DNA is contributing to evolutionary biology. Unique recombination patterns and rare haplotypes found in certain indigenous lineages help track ancient migratory routes through South America. These insights are shedding new light on how early human populations moved, settled, and adapted to extreme environments, from high-altitude deserts to temperate forests. The biological responses encoded in these genomes, shaped over thousands of years, are now helping researchers understand how humans cope with environmental stress, from hypoxia to ultraviolet radiation. There's also rising interest in how admixed populations, like Chile's, can inform the study of gene-environment interactions. The blending of ancestries creates a genetic framework where different ancestral traits interact within a single individual. This allows scientists to observe how genes from different backgrounds respond collectively to modern challenges, diet changes, pollution, urban living, offering insights that more genetically homogeneous populations cannot provide. What makes Chile especially valuable is the degree of regional variation within its population. Each zone carries distinct ancestral ratios, shaped by geography, history, and migration. This internal diversity enables comparative research without crossing national borders. In one country, scientists can study multiple population models, a rare advantage for any nation contributing to global genetics. But the potential goes beyond academia. As more Chileans participate in genetic studies and personal ancestry tests, public awareness is growing. Schools are incorporating genetics into science curricula. Health campaigns are beginning to explore the role of ancestry in prevention strategies. The public discourse is shifting from curiosity to empowerment, where understanding one's genome is not just about roots, but about choices and possibilities. Chile is no longer just a case study, it's a collaborator, a contributor to a broader conversation about what it means to be human in the age of genomics. And as researchers continue to mine its genetic complexity, the rest of the world is starting to listen more closely, realizing that the answers they seek might be found in the southern edge of the world, in the bloodlines of a people whose diversity holds keys to a healthier, more informed future. Some stories can be traced on maps, others in names and language, but the deepest stories, the ones that define a people at their core, are carried silently, cell by cell. The genetic story of Chile is not a straight line. It's not a simple mix or a tidy percentage. It's a living record of migration, survival, conflict, love, and adaptation, woven together through centuries and passed down in silence, long before most knew it was even there. Today, that silence is breaking. With every genome sequenced, a new detail emerges about what it truly means to be Chilean, and how far that meaning stretches. Beneath the surface, there's no singular identity. There's no single origin. Instead, there's a rich mosaic of ancestries layered through time. From ancient hunters who walked across glaciers, to settlers from the Mediterranean, to travelers from the Middle East. Their stories didn't just meet in Chile. They fused, quietly, generation after generation. And that fusion didn't just create diversity. It created resilience. Through centuries of upheaval, genetic lineages persisted when records were lost, when languages disappeared, when cultures were suppressed. It is in the bloodlines, not the textbooks, where the full history endures. The indigenous mothers who carried forward unbroken mitochondrial lineages. The African ancestors whose legacy was nearly erased, but not forgotten. The immigrants who came with hopes of building something new, and in doing so, left traces in the generations to come. What emerges is not a perfect blend, but a powerful one. A reminder that ancestry is not about purity or uniformity. It's about complexity. It's about the fact that identity isn't something that can be seen at a glance. It has to be understood, layer by layer. In this understanding, labels lose their edge. What matters is the journey behind them. In this genetic mirror, Chile doesn't just see its past. It confronts its present. It challenges myths, reshapes assumptions, and redefines pride. Because to know your ancestry is not only to know where you came from, but to see everyone who stood before you, and realize that you are made of all of them. And so, what is the DNA of Chileans? It is not a code to be reduced or a percentage to be boxed. It is a dynamic, evolving story. One that cannot be told by appearance or surname alone. It lives in the hidden places and waits patiently to be recognized, not just as data, but as a legacy.